All right, welcome to the Week 5 Forum. This week we are learning about development. The authors begin the chapter by discussing the different economies and political realities between North and South Korea. These are two countries that were for centuries one country, so they provide an excellent basis for comparison, which we can discuss over the course of this week if you want. Clearly, South Korea has twice the population. A significantly greater portion of its geography is arable. Its economy is, by leaps and bounds, larger and more productive, and its human development index is very high. North Korea's situation is pretty much the inverse. What kind of lessons can we draw from this comparison? So how can we as social scientists gauge the effectiveness of a nation's development process? There are a number of important measures to consider. What is the poverty line in a particular country? Where is the poverty line in the United States? What are some of the challenges associated with identifying degrees of poverty? What are some other measures that we need to look at? James Mill, who was a 19th century utilitarian philosopher who was also the father of John Stuart Mill, once wrote a magisterial study of India, and he argued that the criterion by which we should measure a societies by how they treat their most vulnerable members of their population, particularly the very young and the very old. An important measurement of that is called the Human Development Index, or HDI, which is like a Gini coefficient that we discussed last week. It generates a composite measure of factors like life expectancy and educational outcomes into a single measure. The closer to 1.0, the higher is, the better is the Human Development Index. The closer to 0, the worse a country appears to be doing. Norway, Switzerland, Australia, Ireland, and Germany rank very high, among the highest on HDI, while Niger, Chad, Yemen, and Haiti mark on the lower end. And failed states like Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia are really low on the HDI scale. Where does the United States rank in HDI? What accounts for our ranking, which I believe is like 16 or something like that. The case in context box on page 102 asks a very important question related to development. When are national resources sometimes a curse? The idea of a resource curse is that some resources create enormous incentives for corruption, which creates the paradox that countries need to develop their natural resources in order to build up their economies. But in some instances, the natural resources like oil or diamonds or precious minerals actually deepen the corruption in a country, which further intensifies the poverty. So again, paradoxically, while the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and that kind of division is typically not very sustainable. So, it's really interesting to me that the discovery of diamonds in Sierra Leone or the discovery of oil in Nigeria has actually worked to the detriment of the poor people of those countries. And in contrast, Norway pioneered deep sea oil drilling in the North Atlantic, and they have prospered. What explains that contrast? Why is, what in one country becomes a curse becomes a boon in another country? As comparativists, we're always interested in cause and effect. So why does development happen? What are we as comparativists looking at to evaluate a country's development? In addition to HDI as a measure, we want to look at gender relations and how racial and ethnic minorities are treated in a developing country. The transition to a modern economy often puts tremendous stress on culturally conservative nations. In particular, the role that women play in society often changes quite a bit. And the more conservative elements of society are often the most resistant to those kinds of changes, and those are usually happening in rural and poor areas. Likewise, ethnic and racial minorities are often stigmatized in developing countries, as development often sets off a mad scramble for resources that is often perceived as a zero-sum, devil take the hindmost kind of conflict, and that will often unleash racial and ethnic antagonisms that may have lain dormant in a country for decades. I think it's really important that more comparativists are interested in trying to measure affective qualities like happiness and life satisfaction. How do you go about measuring happiness? They say Denmark is one of the happiest countries in the world. Why are they so happy? One important consideration we need to consider for development is the idea of sustainability. When you look at some of the high earning countries that have high, per capita income in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, clearly they are considered to be very affluent. But their economies are entirely devoted to oil production, and they have a lot of it. And most of those countries have tried to distribute the largesse of their oil wealth in ways that consolidate the legitimacy of the regimes that are governing them. But how long before the oil reserves run dry? And then what? Right? It's important that for these monocultures, these cultures that are entirely devoted to one industry, to diversify their economies before the oil runs out. I think that's a lesson that as a state, Oklahoma needs to learn, and several other states as well. I noted in the overview that there are two basic approaches to development, market-led and state-led. How would you analyze the advantages and disadvantages of each approach? Again, remember, we have to try to be fair and objective, right, when we think about these things. As Americans, we generally have a bias towards markets. But what if the markets are rigged? To me, one of the biggest illustrations of the flaws of a market-led approach is post-Cold War Russia. Russians, consulted American economists on how to manage the transition from a command economy to a market economy, and American economists advised the Russians to rip off the Band-Aid, right, to transition as rapidly as possible to a market economy. But what happened? The result, was that Russian mobsters and former KGB officers were the ones with the capital to seize all the assets the Russian state was selling off. And the resulting Hobbesian war of all against all brought someone like Vladimir Putin to his current position of near absolute power. As the late John McCain once described Russia, it's a gas station masquerading as a country. If so, today it's a gas station run by a mob family. Not a great, state of affairs. Probably wasn't the best, transition approach. The country that we're profiling this week is Brazil, which is, like us, a federal republic, is the largest country in Latin America with the 5th largest geographic territory and the 5th most populous, country. It has over 208 million people living in it. It's considered to be one of the BRICS, which these are the second-tier economies that are close to economic takeoffs. Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Politically, Brazil has gone through extended periods of authoritarian rule, mostly by military juntas. A former left-wing president, Lula da Silva, was recently jailed on corruption charges, and the Brazilian Senate successfully impeached another leftist president, Dilma Rousseff, also on corruption charges. And in 2018, a right-wing candidate, Jair Bolsonaro, a longtime backbencher who was elected on the promise to clean up corruption, became president of Brazil. So reading the profile of Brazil, what stands out about its politics and political culture? What is the thing you read from the profile that most contributes to your understanding of Brazilian government and politics? What is the thing about Brazilian politics that you have the most difficulty understanding? And the same with the text, right? As always, if you have a question about Chapter 5 or Brazil, just ask a question in the forum. I consider that to be a legitimate form of participation. Let's have a great week.